Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this final series of online training talks delivered by the Upper Thames branch Trust for Conservation. My name is Carla Rodwell and I'm the Biodiversity Officer at the Parks Trust in Milton Keynes. For those of you who are not aware of the Parks Trust, we're an independent charity that look after and manage the parkland and green space in Milton Keynes, about which we have 6,000 acres and increasing. So without going on too much, if you're happy to mute yourselves, we are recording this evening's training, and if you could turn your videos off as well to help save our bandwidth. So I will now, without further delay, pass you on to Nick. Also, sorry, you can ask questions, and we're just saying if you can put your questions in the chat, please. Ellen is going to help facilitate the questions. Thank you, Ellen. Right, pass over to the main man himself, Nick Bowles. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Carla. Thank you. Carla, is it possible to, in the same way that you can mute everybody, is it possible to turn off everybody's video? Because I think the bandwidth is suffering. If you can't do it, you can't. But I noticed quite a lot of people have still got their videos on. I'll carry on anyway. And I'll say thank you very much to everybody that's joined us this evening. It's really good that everyone has managed to get in and take part in this last session. I'm hoping there'll be lots and lots of questions. So please, if you've got questions and you can type them into the chat so that Ellen can read them to me, that'd be brilliant. But if you want, when we get to the part where we pause for questions, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question verbally when we at that pause part, then that'd be fine, provided you mute yourself again afterwards, please. So I'm quite happy to take verbal questions, but it is easier for the smooth running of things if you can, that you do them by typing them into the chat. Right, I'll share my screen and we'll get started on the session. One thing that I probably should explain is that I'm hoping that I can rush through much of the identification of the butterfly that we've already talked about in the two previous sessions, because otherwise we'd be here for hours. I expect it's going to take over an hour anyway, but it would definitely take more like 2 to 3 if we went through every butterfly that's flying at the moment, because luckily there are lots of species on the wing at the moment. I often say this, but I think it's worth repeating it. The very best way to identify butterflies is usually to look at their wing edges. Rather than worrying about what color they are, look at the detail on the wing edge first. It doesn't help quite so much with some of those summer brown species like meadow brown and gatekeeper and so on, but for most species, the wing edges are the most helpful detail that you can note. Things like color and size are secondary. They are helpful, but the wing edges are best. Eye spots, if there are any, are worth noting, and look at them in some detail with the summer butterflies to see whether they are blind spots, that's to say black without a white eye, or black with a white pupil, or possibly white with a black pupil. The size of a butterfly can change, so you sometimes get very small butterflies of a particular species, which are smaller than another butterfly of a separate species which is named as smaller. So you might see a smaller large white than a small white flying near it. But the actions and the location, the time of year, are always very helpful at identifying butterflies. As it says on the screen, those which are chasing others are usually a male, and those which are flying around food plants are usually the females looking to lay eggs. Sometimes you'll find the males flying around the food plant because they know that's where the females that were caterpillars eating that food plant are going to hatch out. As I've just explained, we're not going to spend time on every single butterfly that you might see at the moment. We're only going to do most of them, the ones we haven't really concentrated on previously. And you can find information about those that I'll gloss over to an extent on the website, the Upper Thames branch website, and I've put the link there I don't know, Ellen is very clever. I bet by some method or another, she'll be able to type that into the chat for people so they can copy it if they want. But it might be that you could just press print screen and you'd get that. You could then copy it and paste it into something. Not absolutely sure if that works when we're sharing a screen, but it might. Okay, let's press on. So Red Admiral and Painted Lady, 2 migrants, which were a little while ago, both quite prevalent in the country. I was seeing them all over the place. Painted Lady numbers seem to have gone down at the moment, but I have heard reports of caterpillars locally. So I'm quite sure that they're both going to be about in big numbers by the middle of August. Red Admirals aren't in small numbers at the moment. They're everywhere in small numbers as opposed to anywhere in big numbers, but I think their numbers are going to go up quite markedly. And probably round about the time that most people's buddleias are in flower, we should be seeing quite a lot of these. I've mentioned on the page there about the wingtips because you will also be seeing silverwash fritillaries at the moment, which look a bit like Painted Ladies. And if you look at this picture, which is of a silverwash fritillary, you can see the difference in the wing tips. So Painted Lady, obvious black and white. Silverwashed, black but orange, no white at all. Now, the Painted Lady and Red Admiral are part of a group of butterflies called nymphalids, and they do look a bit similar in some ways. When they fly about, the comma, the tortoiseshell and the Painted Lady do look very similar. And against the sky, they all give you a black silhouette, as does the Red Admiral and the peacock. But I think we can probably remember how to tell these apart. With the Painted Lady, we're looking for the white in the wingtips. With the comma, we're looking for the distinctive shape, the tortoiseshell, the blue around the edges, and the peacock, the eyes, of course. The undersides are a bit more difficult. And here I've given you the undersides of comma, and it's that same wavy outline. We're always looking at wing edges as our starting point, wavy outline. With the tortoiseshell, you should be able to see the blue on the outline. The peacock is much less contrasty. Obviously, it's a little bit jagged, this outline, but not anything like the wavy contours here. And this is a separate species that wasn't on the previous slides, the speckled wood, which you might confuse when it's resting because it does look a bit like them, but much more orange brown as opposed to quite grey brown. And one thing that you'll notice about the speckled wood is the way that the veins on the hind wing tend to give it a sort of wavy appearance. They're quite prominent, so you get this fluted appearance to the hind wing. The underside of the Red Admiral and the Painted Lady, in my opinion, are absolutely exquisite, beautiful butterflies. And you can see that they feature a number of eye spots all down the edge of the wing, which is a very good way of telling them from any of the other brown butterflies of approximately this size. They don't have eye spots as the Red Admiral and Painted Lady do. And you can see, I'm sure, that the Red Admiral is much darker than the Painted Lady. Okay, let's get on to the fritillaries, which are also in this group, but a sort of separate subfamily within it. And we've got 2 fritillaries flying at the moment in this area that you're likely to see. The dark green fritillary is a little bit more restricted in its range. It's mostly in the Chiltern grasslands, but it can be found in grasslands almost anywhere and in some woodlands. So the dark green fritillary, I like to use the alliteration, the D for dot and the G for grassland. The dark green fritillary is the dotty, here we are, the dotty fritillary that flies in grasslands, and the silver washed, S for stripy, W for woodland, the stripy woodland fritillary. So when they fly about, they will look very similar. If you're lucky, you can see that as it flies, the shape of the silver washed is far more pointy. This is a much more rounded wing, isn't it? But you have to be fairly close and they need to be flying quite slowly. The silver wash does fly more slowly. The dark green flies more rapidly, a very rapid wing beat, and the dark green is actually less likely to stop. So if you're in a grassland setting and there is an orange fritillary zapping about, flying around constantly, never seeming to stop, then there's a good chance it's the dark green. In a woodland setting, if there's a butterfly flying about, it's more likely to be a silver washed, but the undersides of the two butterflies are the best way to tell them apart. Dots on the dark green, stripes on the silver washed. The upper sides for many people are confusingly similar, but one good way to tell them apart, in addition to the pointy wingtips, is that if you look at the wing edges, back to the wing edges, the silver wash fritillary is pretty much the same color orange right the way across the wing, right up to the wing edge. The dark green fritillary becomes paler as it goes towards the edge. And in the female dark green fritillary in particular, this can be so silvery on the edge that it's actually quite visible as it flies, that it does have silvery edges. The males, not quite so obvious. They are paler, but not quite so obvious. But when they settle, you might be able to see that. And you can probably see, if you get a good look at the upper side, certainly from a photograph, that the range of spots that go along just inside the margin on the dark green fritillary here and here form a fairly straight line, don't they? Whereas on the silver washed, it's not so obvious, and they're more tear-shaped rather than dots. The male silver washed also has, this is a female on the picture, but the male silver washed also has very prominent veins which stand out quite clearly. Okay, that's the nymphalids and the fritillaries. I'm just going to pause and see if there are any questions about nymphalids and fritillaries, please.
No questions on the chat so far.
No, okay, well, we can always come back to it, but I wouldn't expect it because apart from the fritillaries, we've been through the others so often that I'm sure everybody's familiar with them now. Okay, we're moving to the whites family, the family of butterflies which are known as whites, but we're starting with a couple of yellow ones. At the moment, to the best of my knowledge, there are no clouded yellows in this region. And I say that and immediately we'll get somebody putting into chat, I saw one today, but I don't think we've had a major influx of this butterfly, which is a migrant coming up from the continent. But there are certainly going to be a lot of brimstones about. They're just beginning to emerge in what is effectively their first brood, because remember, the ones we saw in the spring hibernated from last year's brood. So this year's brood of fresh brimstones will be about soon. The male is this lovely lemon yellow color, and the clouded yellow over here is a much darker custard yellow color. But the biggest single giveaway, if you get them stopped so that you can look at them, is the wing shape, with the wing tips of the brimstone being very pointed, whereas the clouded yellow is much more rounded. So brimstone, paler, pointy wing tips, and you'll notice that the spot on the brimstone's hind wing is dark, whereas the spot on the clouded yellow hind wing usually, not absolutely for always, but usually has a large white spot in the center. There's always some white, but sometimes that can be reduced. Okay. Now, both the brimstone and the female clouded yellow come in very pale forms. So the female brimstone is always this pale, almost lime green color, which looks white when it flies. And the female clouded yellow can be either the same color as the male, the custard yellow color, or extremely pale, pretty much white when it flies. When it settles, you'll see that it has got a yellower underside. And once again, just like the male, it's got this white spot in the center of the hind wing. The brimstone, as you can see here, this one is paler because this is the female brimstone. She is paler, and so that white area there isn't quite so obviously dark as in the male. But the pointed wingtips are a real giveaway that this is a brimstone. The shape of the brimstone is a giveaway. The brimstone is slightly larger than the clouded yellow, but I wouldn't use size to tell these apart. The males are best told apart by the depth of color, with the male brimstone being a pale yellow and the clouded yellow being a much deeper yellow. And then if you see the females, I think the best thing is to wait for them to stop if they do, because then you can see the wing shape and see the pointy tips on the female brimstone and the rounded shape with the pink edges on the clouded yellow female. Now, probably one of the most difficult groups to separate at all are the whites that we think of as being the sort of more common garden ones, and some of these obviously will attack cabbages. So we've got small white at the top and large white on the right, both of which have caterpillars that will eat cabbages, so you find them very regularly around gardens and allotments in urban areas. But luckily for us, I've been through this before, so I'm going through it fairly quickly. The small white has small amounts of black at the wing tips, and often that black, as I've just referred to it, is actually grey. So the wing tips, very grey, whereas the large white has large amounts of black, very extensively, both across the top of the leading edge and down the trailing edge. There's an obvious L shape, which helps with it being called a large white, of black right around the wingtip. The green veined white, which is a butterfly that doesn't usually lay its eggs on cabbages, but it can. It prefers things like Jack by the hedge and other wild crucifers, mustard, hedge mustard, and so on. But the green veined white can have variable amounts of black, which usually comes down about as far as this spot on the wing here. So that spot, which is called the cell spot, will have veins running from it, which are slightly darker and always ending in little grey or black chevrons. So a very dark green veined fritillary will have really black marks on the wingtips here. And all these little chevrons will be really obvious. But some green vein whites are so pale, you have to look very carefully to see if it's got these chevrons or not. It is easier to tell a green veined white from the underside than the upper side. And if you've been listening to our videos already, this being the third in the series, then you'll have noticed that I have deliberately mixed up male and female butterflies. The male small white, the male large white, and the male green veined white all have a single spot just here on the forewing, but the females of all three have two spots plus a little streak. So this male has one spot, and if we were looking at a male large white, it would have one spot. If we were looking at a male green veined white, it would have one spot. And similarly, if we were looking at a female small white, it would have two spots. So the sex is determined by the number of spots, but not the species. The undersides of the whites, perhaps slightly more difficult than the upper sides for the small white here and the large white, but you should be able to see how this black color shows through. And if it doesn't, you're looking at a small white. There is also the thing that small whites have much more gray towards the base of the wing and less gray scales, that is gray scales, on the top half of the hind wing. With the green vein white, the gray scales, which are scattered all over the large white hind wing, are arranged along the veins, which is why it's called the green veined white, because they look greenish. These gray scales on a yellowish background make it look greenish, but they're always along the veins. Okay, well, yeah, that's all we want to say about the whites, because I've assumed that we're probably not going to be seeing many wood whites at this time of year. You might conceivably come across a wood white, but it's very unlikely because the wood whites are a bit late flying in their first brood this year, and that usually means the second brood is very small. They only fly on the North Bucks border anyway, so I think most of us are probably not going to see a wood white in the Upper Thames region this late summer. Are there any questions, Ellen, in the chat about either the nymphalid family and the fritillaries or the whites?
Nope, still no questions.
Wow. Okay. Well, we move on to another group. I am going to go more slowly, folks, with the things that are new to us for the season when we get there. You can see here we have a small copper and the difference between the small copper and all the other species when you're looking at the upper side is the black hind wing. No other species has a bright orange forewing and a black hind wing with an orange border. The small heath underside, sorry, the small copper underside here at the top is peculiar in my opinion, because we can see that the orange of the forewing shows through, but the black of the hind wing from the upper side of the small copper has vanished and been replaced with this fawn color. So it is quite possible, I think, that you could confuse small copper with small heath. They're roughly the same size. You'll notice, though, that the small heath has a single eye spot on the forewing. Most impressive, no, not impressive, most useful, don't know why I said impressive. The most useful way of telling these apart, though, is this streak here, this very pale streak, which goes about halfway across the hind wing. So only the small heath of all the British species has a streak which goes halfway from the top of the hind wing to the center, separating this very dark center from the paler outside. Pale outside, dark center, half a streak of very pale, possibly even quite bright white on a very fresh specimen. So there's no similar streak halfway on any species. The large skipper I stuck on this page because when a small copper, a small heath, or a large skipper are flying around, they could well look to you just to be small orange butterflies zipping about and hard to tell apart. But you need to wait for them to stop. And one of the very good things about the small copper and the large skipper is that by and large, wherever you manage to scare them off from, or wherever you see them take off from, if you wait, usually within a minute or so, they're back where you saw them. They both, the male small copper and the male large skipper, adopt territories which they defend. So they will come back pretty much to the same leaf, but certainly the same area from which you scared them away or from which they flew off. So just wait there or come back again to that spot in a few minutes, and they should be back on the position defending their territory, where you'll be able to see whether it's this bright orange contrasted with black for the small copper, or pretty much entirely orange for the large skipper, or with its wings closed because the small heath never opens its wings when it settles. This pattern here of dark separated by half a streak of very pale and then a grayish outer. So those three are best separated when they're settled, but luckily for us, the two here, the small copper and large skipper, almost always come back to the same spot from which they start to fly to take up their resting position. Not quite so with the small heath, but can't have everything. Now, the large skipper can very easily be confused with a much rarer, and you might argue more beautiful skipper that is now flying. It started to fly just a couple of days ago, and by the weekend it will probably be out in our area. It's almost exclusively confined to the chalk soil. So there's one or two places you might just see it where you're off the chalk in valleys between chalk hills. But by and large, the only place you're going to see a silver-spotted skipper is on extremely short turf on chalk hills. Some possibly in Berkshire, although it's really declined very badly in Berkshire recently. Some in Oxfordshire on the hills of the edge of the Chilterns, and then in the Chilterns quite widely on the chalk hills of Buckinghamshire. And the way to tell these two very similar species apart is that if you look at the large skipper here on the left, you'll see that there are darker edges to the orange ground color and some very pale marks in amongst the darker areas at the wing edges. On the silver spotted skipper, they're not pale areas, they're actually quite bright creamy gold colored. There's a much stronger contrast. and the entire wing area is slightly darker. So this contrast is even more pronounced. You'll notice there's a appearance of a black dot there formed by the pale colours around it. So the large skipper is less contrasty than the silver spotted. The way to be really certain is to look at the undersides, where the same pale marks that we could see on the top surface of the large skipper show up as very faint ghosts of marks. They can be extremely pale and hard to discern, but they are there if you look closely enough. The silver spotted skipper, these spots are always really bright, but the biggest single absolute clincher, the thing that means you can't possibly wrong about this being a silver spotted skipper, is that there's an arc of 3 spots just here, right by the body. And the large skipper never has bright spots there. You will occasionally see some female large skippers where what I referred to as the ghost of spots here are not ghostly at all. They're really quite well marked, but they're always a pale version of the same ground color, and they're never this bright silvery white, and they are never ever by the body just here. So if you see a large, well, for a skipper, obviously it's a small butterfly, but a very stocky and larger than smaller Essex skipper butterfly zipping about, then it's one of these 2 species. The large skipper quite often settle up on bushes or fairly tall vegetation, like on the top of a thistle or something. The silver spotted skipper almost never goes above ankle height. They fly very close to the ground, but very powerfully. Makes them difficult to follow when you're trying to follow them by eye. So these are much more powerful. They look stocky, bulky. They look like brutes as they charge about across the low turf. The large skipper's more likely to be seen actually somewhere where there's a bit taller vegetation, often on the edges of woodland or scrub, and the silver spotted skipper well away from woodland, only on the short turf grassland. It might be the edge of a wood if you've got some very short turf grassland that goes up to the woodland, but not in the woodland itself. Large skippers can occur in woodland, but they also occur on grassland. So these 2 are a test. You're very unlikely to see this one, the silver spotted skipper, in North Bucks or North Oxfordshire. It is just possible you'll see it in the Berkshire Downs, but the numbers have declined dreadfully. You won't see the silver spotted skipper in the heath or woodland of Berkshire, and you won't see it in the woodland of Oxfordshire and Bucks either, because it doesn't go into woods. But the large skipper you can see throughout. So it's everywhere in the 3 counties. It's even in urban areas, you'll find it on little bits of rough ground in the middle of towns. So the large skipper's much more widespread and a bit more variable in that these pale, as I refer to them, ghosts of spots, which show through here, can be a little bit brighter than in this individual, although this is average, this is about right for what most of them look like. It can be a bit brighter, but nothing like this, and never with that arc of pale spots there. Now, unfortunately, the large skipper has 2 equally common cousins, as it were. So here's a large skipper, a small skipper, and an Essex skipper. And these are very similar, but we did mention these pale spots. So you have to look to see if you can see those pale spots on the skipper. If there's no sign of those pale spots, we're then looking to see whether there is a sandy coloured, well, perhaps it isn't quite sandy, but a pale buff coloured tip to the wing, or a uniform sandy colour to the wing. And then we have to get in to look at the antenna. We'll come to that in a minute. One more thing I didn't mention, I'll just go back to the large skipper and the silver spotter. Sorry to go backwards, but if you look at the antenna of a large skipper, and I don't know how clearly you'll be able to see this on your screens, I can just see it on mine. The large skipper antenna have a little point. They look like the curly toes of Turkish slippers. And the silver spotted skipper doesn't have that. The antennae are quite rounded at the tops, at the tips. So pointy tips on a large skipper, rounded tips on a silver spotted skipper. But I doubt many of you will be looking at the antenna on a silver spotted skipper. You'll be looking for this arc of spots here. But it is important to know about that pointy tip to the large skipper antenna, because people remember that with a small skipper, the antenna are usually orangey color underneath, and the Essex skipper black underneath. But what quite a lot of people make a mistake with is that the large skipper has black antenna, look. So we go to the next slide. Here's the Essex skipper shot from just below, and this is what you need to do to be certain. Get yourself just below the butterfly and look up, and you'll see that with an Essex skipper, the orange stalk of the antenna changes very abruptly to completely black. Very abruptly. If we look at a small skipper, there's a slightly more gradual change, and usually it's obviously orangey brown or chocolate brown and not black. It can be very dark, but if it isn't this abrupt change, then it isn't an Essex skipper. So the small skipper, where you can see, look here, coming back to this point about the fact that the orangey color doesn't go all the way to the wingtip. Obviously a different color at the wingtip on a small skipper, usually, not always. But the Essex skipper, the color is pretty much the same. It's uniform right the way across. Not as orange, is it? But it's uniform. So the small skipper orange on a rounded tip, Essex skipper black tipped just at the end, obvious contrast, and rounded tips. So the large skipper here also has black tips when you look from underneath, but I hope you can see the points on the end of these antennae. So the large skipper and the Essex both have black tips. I'm pointing at the small skipper. The large skipper and the Essex skipper, get it right, both have black tips. The small skipper has orange tips underneath. There we are, small skipper orange underneath, Essex skipper black tips here. The small and the Essex both have rounded tips, and the large skipper does have black tips like the Essex, but they're pointed. If you're looking at male small and Essex skippers, and in this case, I'm afraid it's not as helpful as the small and large white, where the small white has the smallest amount of black. The small skipper has a longer, wavy scent mark. This is only on the male because only the male has this scent mark. The Essex skipper has a much shorter and straighter scent mark. So you can tell the males apart if you can't see underneath them, if they're somewhere in the vegetation where it's impossible to get underneath to look under the antenna. And for many of us, it's difficult to get down there anyway. But if you can see on top and you're looking at a male, you should be able to see how long this mark is compared with the width of the wing. And you should be able to see this is about half the width of the wing, isn't it? From the body along the abdomen for about half the distance, perhaps slightly more. Whereas the Essex skipper is a much shorter mark, perhaps only a third of the length of the abdomen. You'll find various tips to telling small skipper and Essex skipper apart. This one is a definite one. If you can get a photo or if you get a good look at the upper surface, upper wings of a small or Essex skipper male, you can definitely tell them apart this way. This is absolutely unchallengeable. There is no way that that could be wrong. You will find that the antenna tips thing is also completely right, except that occasionally small skippers can be very dark. So then you're looking to see if the dark color, which looks almost black perhaps, is an abrupt change. But the wingtips is a bit more difficult. The small skipper, you can usually see this change, but it isn't always so obvious, especially in worn specimens. And some people will say that the thicker black on the edge of the Essex bleeds down the veins more than it does on the small. But again, that varies between individuals and is a bit difficult to see. So the two things to help you tell the small and Essex skipper apart with certainty if you're looking at a male, you need to look at the scent marks, small on the Essex, larger on the small, longer. And if you're looking at the antenna on either the male or the female, the Essex skipper has the dark rounded tips, which are a real contrast from the orange stems, whereas the small skipper has the gradually darkening, sometimes to very dark tips, rounded, with the large skipper having pointed black tips. One more thing that might help you, small skippers are quite capable of living in very dense grassland. So an awful lot of clay soil where the grasses grow very densely would be quite a reasonable place for small skipper caterpillars to grow up. Essex skippers don't have caterpillars that are capable of coping with the same sort of colder temperatures that you get in these dense grasses. They tend to be found where the grasses are a bit more sparse, where the grass grows with a certain amount of space between the grass blades. So Essex skippers are slightly more likely on the chalky soils, the sandy soils, and on industrial sites, perhaps ex-industrial sites where there's some concrete under the ground, something like that. And also roadside verges, because the spraying of salt onto the roads in the winter to combat the ice on the road surface tends to weaken the grass that grows along the edge of the verge. And as a result, the grasses growing on road verge edges can be quite weak, pathetic, but it suits the Essex skipper caterpillar because it does warm up faster in the spring when the sun is shining through the grasses, where the grass isn't growing quite so thickly on road verges. So the Essex skipper caterpillar can cope there because it warms up better than it would in very thick grass in the middle of, say, a very well fertilized hay meadow or something. But both these skippers, unfortunately for us, both these skippers fly in very similar habitat, and you'll often find both together. Very often you'll find both together. Occasionally there is only the small skipper. I don't think there are many sites in our area where you would only find the Essex. So I think you'd probably find either both or perhaps just the small skipper along with the large skipper. Now we're going to look at the moths in a minute. We're just going to touch on them, but I'll wait for a little while and see if there are any questions about skippers. Let's go back.
Yes, and we've got a question going back to the clouded yellow as well. So someone would like to know
if there are go right back to that.
If there are any good areas to see the clouded yellow in the area.
Well, I think the answer to that is unfortunately no. There are no predictable places that you're definitely going to see it. The clouded yellow comes in as a migrant, so it tends to be wherever it turns up and finds its food plant, which is birdsfoot trefoil and clovers. So places where it's for some reason been seen in good numbers in recent years, at Meadow Farm near Bester, which is a bee bat reserve, and it's also reasonably common in the late summer on the Berkshire Downs, but again it could be any one of many hillsides there. It doesn't seem to have anywhere in particular, unless you can go right down to the south coast, where along the coasts of places like Dorset and Hampshire it's fairly common along the coast, but there isn't anywhere locally that I could say was a predictable site, I'm afraid.
Okay, thanks. And then onto the skippers. So are the large and silver spotted skippers similar in size?
Yes, very similar. Although the silver spotted skipper always, I don't think it is particularly, but it always looks bulkier, more robust. But they're very similar in size.
Thank you. And does the silver spotted skipper return to the same place when disturbed?
Not as much as the large skipper. They do, but not as much as the large skipper, not as frequently, not as reliably. By and large, though, one of the things about the silver spotted skipper, if you find just a single individual, there's no way of telling particularly, but they do tend to live in little colonies in a relatively small area. So if you think you've seen one and you hang about, you probably will get another glimpse of either that one or another one fairly soon afterwards. They need this very short turf. They lay their eggs on a plant called sheep's fescue, which is a grass that grows just a few centimeters tall at the most, very thin bladed grass that can only grow where there's very little competition from other grasses. And there aren't all that many places like that around. It tends to be steep south facing slopes. And so these few places where it can live, it can be in reasonably good numbers. So generally speaking, if you see a silver spotted skipper and you hang about, another one will come along fairly soon, although they're not quite as territorial as the large skippers are.
Thanks. And I think that was the final question so far.
Okay, we'll plow on, and I'm always happy to come back.
We've got one. We've got one
I'm
more.
waiting. I'm waiting.
It says,
right.
Are there any identifying features on the antennae of the whites in a similar way to the skippers?
Not that I've ever noticed. I can't tell you that there are. No, I'm sorry. I think they all tend to be white, don't they? Little white tips. I think they're all identical in that respect. So they're black and white stripes, and then a black bulbous head like on a club with a white tip. And I'm afraid they're all like that. So that isn't as much help as it might be. They all look very similar. Okay, we'll move on, shall we? We'll just have a look at some moths. You can ask me another question in a minute if there are any more, Ellen, but let's just look at moths. One of the things that people rarely recognize, and I must admit I'm only recently aware of it, is that there are actually more moths that fly in the day than there are species of butterfly in the UK. So there are plenty of moths that you could well be seeing at the moment, and no doubt when you've been on a walk recently with the weather being a bit iffy, you've seen moths, and you might well have realized that I'm seeing more moths than I am butterflies. I thought I'd just go through some of the ones which are both pretty and quite common. So going down the left-hand side, we've got the red and black at the top, the cinnabar. The yellow and black caterpillars of cinnabar can be found quite easily at the moment on ragwort plants. But this cinnabar moth, the adult with its red and black, you'll notice that the black wing has 2 red dots and a red stripe, which separates it from these 2 little fellas, which are burnet moths. Now, the 6-spot burnet in most sites where you find burnet moths is commoner, and it has 6 spots on each forewing. It hasn't got any stripes. The cinnabar is the only one with a stripe. There are 2 by the body, which sometimes merge together and look like 1, but that's counted as 2. 2 in the middle and 2 at the bottom. The 5-spot burnet and the narrow-bordered 5-spot burnet, which looks pretty much identical. In Berkshire, you've got both, but in Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire, we've only got the narrow-bordered. 2 near the body, 2 in the middle, and just 1 down here at the base look. So this thing about wing edges, it applies to moths as well as to butterflies. If you see a burnet moth, don't waste your time trying to count the spots. Just look at the bottom. If there are 2 at the tip, it's a 6-spot. If there's only 1 at the tip, then it's a 5-spot. And they both have red inner wings like the cinnabar, but this one's folded up so that they can't be seen. I think these are beautiful moths. They're rather nice as well with children. If you've got any children about who might like to have one crawl on their finger, because they're very often quite placid, and you can put your finger out and they'll crawl across the flower as they feed and then onto your finger if it's there, and then you can pick them up and look at them. But if you do try that with your children, don't let them eat them, because they are quite poisonous. So there's a top tip: don't eat those burnet moths, folks. Silver wire moth, this is a moth that's in fairly good numbers already, and its numbers are bound to go up. It's another migrant from abroad. Cinnabar, 6-spot burnet, 5-spot and narrow bordered, those are all homegrown, as it were. But the silver wire is another migrant species, like the clouded yellow and the painted lady. It's been coming in numbers all year, and the numbers have built up quite well. Its caterpillars can eat a whole range of different food plants, things like dandelions, common plants. So it does pretty well once it gets here in the spring. And the reason it's called the silver wire is this mark here, which I'm sure that all of you can use your imagination and see that as a silver coloured Y. One of the things about this moth that you'll notice when you see it in the field is that its wings seem to move pretty much constantly, a constant blur of motion, even when it's settled. And this is to warm up its flight muscles, so that if something threatens it, it can zip off quickly. So silver wine moth, and another similar constant motion moth, but much more appealing, is the hummingbird hawk moth. In fact, visually, in terms of its patterns, there isn't a great deal of color to sing about, but the way it zips about the flowers, never actually settling, but just using a very long tongue, which isn't visible in this picture. It's there, but the picture's too dark to show it properly. Hummingbird hawk moth flies from flower to flower, feeding, hovering in front of them, and then zipping sideways to another flower and feeding again before zipping off sideways again. Absolutely cracking moth. This again is a migrant from abroad, and this one lays its eggs on bedstraws. So if you've got any hedge bedstraw, ladies' bedstraw in the garden or in fields near you, then you could well have hummingbird hawk moth breeding there, because it's quite capable of breeding in gardens, provided, and I'm sure none of you listening would have done this, provided you haven't pulled out things like hedge bedstraw and ladies' bedstraw, because you'll know that hummingbird hawk moths are beautiful and you'll want to provide them with a food plant for their caterpillars. Up here we've got the mint moth, which actually is more likely to be feeding on marjoram, or oregano you might call it. So this moth can feed on various mint species and is very common in gardens, but it's tiny. The name small purple and gold, which is another common name that this one goes under, could be changed to tiny purple and gold. It's very small, but it's very pretty. If you've got any marjoram growing in the garden, or perhaps an extensive bed of mint, have a look for this. It's quite active during the day, but it isn't something that's really very obvious because it's so small, but very pretty. And then there's a whole range of things like the straw dot and the grass rivulet and so on, which are shades of yellow, greys, whites, with various bands across them, the whole load of carpet moths as well, all with similar patterning and all extremely beautiful when you get a chance to see them properly. Unfortunately, they've all got a habit of diving into the vegetation and burying themselves underneath a few leaves, making it hard to spot them. But every now and again they make a mistake and they sit on the top of something and you can see them, and they are exquisitely beautiful. Well worth getting to know those. And then right at the bottom, another cracking moth, which has become much more common across the Upper Thames area, the scarlet tiger, breeding in gardens, waste places, all sorts of areas wherever it can find its food plants, which are things like comfrey and green alkanet, along with the Jersey tiger, which is restricted more to Berkshire and the areas close to outer London. The Jersey tiger, which is stripy on the top, otherwise a very similar pattern, and the scarlet tiger are becoming more common, and many people are seeing them. And of course, because they fly in the day and they're black and red, they can get mistaken for red admirals when they fly past, but they're a bit clumsy in their flight, both the Jersey and the scarlet tiger. And a good way to tell them, if you see them fly past and land at some distance from you, if they land rather clumsy, if they sort of fly into things as opposed to deliberately settle upon them, quite often it's a scarlet tiger or a Jersey tiger, because red admiral, which does look similar in flight, is going to land with a certain amount of care and consideration. It chooses the perch. It doesn't just blunder into it in quite the same way. But they are absolutely gorgeous, and it's a great thing that they've become more common. Many more types of day flying moth than I can possibly show you here because we haven't got time, but obviously they're just as exquisite, and their caterpillars are just as valuable as food to lots of little insectivorous birds who are feeding their young. So it's great that we've got so many. Now we're going to go on to some different things. So are there any questions? Probably not very many questions about moths because it's such a big topic. I doubt we've got any questions, but any questions, Alan?
No new questions. Thank you.
Right. Well, it's a bit sneaky putting moths in because this is supposed to be the butterflies. But I thought I'd put it there because we do quite often get people asking us, what's this butterfly, when they've seen a moth that flies in the day. Okay. The purple emperor and the white admiral. Now, very often a problem with separating these two species is that you can see something big and basically black and white, but it's so high above you that it's mostly a silhouette, and it's really hard to tell which of the two you're looking at. So it's worth knowing their behavior. The purple emperor has a very determined flight, and it beats its wings fairly rapidly, not very rapidly, fairly rapidly, and it very rarely goes into a glide unless it's trying to lose height. So if it's high up above some oaks and it wants to come down, it can glide. And when it has come down, it might glide at ground level, but up above the trees, it's very rare to see them gliding. The white admiral, on the other hand, it is very common to see them flying about and gliding, possibly only short glides interspersed with wing bursts. Those wing bursts are more rapid. The wings are flapped more rapidly. And you might, if you're only looking at silhouettes, be able to tell that the white admiral looks slightly more rounded in shape and the purple emperor more pointed. I think you can see it quite well in this wing. It's got quite pointy tips to the wing compared with the white admiral. I agree it's a subtle difference, but I think it is obvious when they're up there as silhouettes that the purple emperor just looks more triangular in shape when it's flying. The purple emperor, remember, only the male has this purple color. So the female will never ever show you any purple color. She will always look exactly the same color scheme as the white admiral, really. Very dark brown or black with white spots. But you'll notice that there are various things about the distribution of these spots which are different. So with the white admiral, the spots make a pretty much straight line here. And with the purple emperor, they curve in towards the body. With the purple emperor, there's an extra spot on the forewing, white spot. Only one spot here, two spots there. But most helpful, because I love alliteration as a way of remembering things, there is an eye on an emperor. In fact, when we see the underside, you'll see that this helps us doubly. But let's stay with the top sides for a moment. So if you're lucky enough to see a purple emperor down low enough that you can see it clearly, has it got eyes? Because if there are eyes here, it's definitely a purple emperor and not a white admiral. The white admiral has a series of dots here, look, little black spots, which don't show through especially well, but are visible, but no eyes anywhere at all. So the white admiral, slightly smaller, often seen gliding at about head height or flying around at about head height down to about knee height. Very fond of feeding on bramble flowers. Purple emperor, usually flying much higher, but can come down to the ground where it will feed on the ground, taking up mineral salts from the soil, but very, very rarely visits any flowers. If you see a butterfly, a big one, triangular shape on the ground, probing with a yellow tongue, because that purple emperor does have a very yellow tongue, then it's probably a purple emperor. Get close and look slowly. And if you see something down on the ground with this sort of wing pattern, and it isn't feeding on the ground, it's just resting and trying to soak up some of the heat from the sun, then it's more likely white admiral. That doesn't come down and take minerals from the soil at all often. I can't say, because it does happen occasionally, that it never happens, but far more likely to take its sustenance from flowers. So here are the undersides. Here's that yellow tongue, by the way. That's convenient that it's in the picture. So the purple emperor, forget me saying red, has got two eyes, look, on the underside. There's the same one we saw on the upper side there, shows through on the underside here. But next to the two white dots that we saw on the upper side, there is a much bigger eye on the purple emperor. The white admiral, no eyes, none at all, and an obviously bigger pale area here. You can't always see that because quite often these two butterflies, when they perch quite high up in a tree or a bush, they will sit in such a way that you can see the top of the wing sticking out, but you can't see the bottom because it's covered by the foliage. So it's worth looking at the top of the wing where you will see that there are no eyes on the White Admiral, but there is an eye on the Emperor. Really worth looking for that. That's such a good clue. And you might be able to see that the shape is really quite triangular, but here it's more rounded. And that shape can be quite a good clue if you're looking at a silhouette, and very often, unfortunately, you will be, because of the way that these butterflies tend to perch way above you, quite high up. If you want to get really technical about it, you can see that there's a bit of a tooth here on the Purple Emperor's white stripe on the underside. And here it's much more regular. I mean, there are little indentations, but nothing like this sticky out tooth. But the eyes are the things that make it easiest to tell the two apart. This is all assuming, by the way, that you haven't seen it sitting with its wings open and reflecting that purple sheen, which the males do. So Purple Emperor, White Admiral, both flying at the moment. Purple Emperors lay their eggs on sallow. Caterpillars eat sallows. Those are pussy willow catkin type things. Trees with pussy willows on. So if you're anywhere near any, and anywhere at all in the Upper Thames region, you might see them. The White Admiral lays its eggs on honeysuckle because its caterpillars eat the honeysuckle, but only honeysuckle growing in complete shade. So you're not likely to see White Admirals in gardens because most people grow their honeysuckle in the sun. And in fact, you're not likely to see White Admiral away from woodland, although it does fly out of woodlands looking for new habitats, and sometimes you can see White Admiral in gardens if it flies through between woodlands. But unless you live right next to a woodland, it's very unlikely you'll see a White Admiral in the garden. White Admirals are much more confined to woodland than Purple Emperors, which can range far and wide and turn up on a very frequent basis on people's gardens, in people's gardens. This is usually, actually, they're just sort of flying through, and if you're lucky, they settle in your garden for a bit before they go on. But it's much more likely, oddly enough, to be a rare Purple Emperor seen in your garden than a White Admiral, which is a more numerous butterfly in some woodlands, but much less numerous in gardens. Okay. I'll just see if there are any questions on Purple Emperor and White Admiral, because they are butterflies that interest lots of people.
No questions on them so far, but we do have an elephant hawk moth question. So someone had an elephant hawk moth in their garden and it stayed for a while but hasn't returned, and they have fuchsias, lavenders, etc. What might attract it back again?
I'm afraid it's one of those questions I can't answer. I don't know that you can really attract them apart from having the food plant for the caterpillars, which are things like rosebay willow herb. So the only thing for certain that will mean you get any species of butterfly moth is to have the food plant for the caterpillar. So although the adults definitely will nectar on those plants, I can't guarantee that planting them will bring in the moth to feed on them. So it's worth looking, but it's more likely, I think. The fuchsia, of course, can be a caterpillar food plant too, can't it? But I think it's best to have the caterpillar food plants and just hope you see the moth either as it's just emerged after the caterpillar has finished feeding and pupated, or that you've seen a female coming in to lay eggs on the food plant. That's probably the best way. Moths, of course, can be trapped with a light trap. That's a good way to find your moths. So if you think you've got elephant hawk moths around, you want to get a good look at them, go outside with a very bright light after dark. I've got a feeling that elephant hawk moths fly at around midnight, between midnight and 1 o'clock. Quite a few moths have a particular time at which they fly about. Probably increases the chance they'll bump into a mate. And I think that's about right for the elephant hawk moth. I'll move on then, Ellen, if there are no other questions.
We have a Purple Emperor question that's come in. So how common is it to see purple on a Purple Emperor?
I'd say it was fairly uncommon. It depends what you mean, really. So the purple color is only apparent when the light strikes the wing of the Purple Emperor at the right angle to reflect that iridescence to your eye. So you can quite often, and especially on an overcast day, see a purple emperor down on the ground and it looks completely black and white, even though it's a male and could cast that purple iridescence. But if you've got the right angle of sunlight, the purple can be really obvious, and all 4 wings look purple. But as you can see in this photograph, only 2 of the wings look purple because only 2 of the wings are at the right angle to reflect the purple sheen. So with this photo, it's possible to get the 2 wings on the left, as here, shining purple, or the 2 wings on the right shining purple by moving my position slightly. But I could never quite get the butterfly with all 4 wings purple, which was annoying, because I just couldn't get it to hold its wings completely flat to the plane of the camera. It always had its wings slightly lifted in the corners, as it were. So I would say you're going to see purple emperors more often without the purple. But if you're lucky enough to find a purple emperor male down on the ground, you can usually walk around it without scaring it. And while you're walking around, you can find the right place to stand and get a picture with the purple sheen showing. But generally speaking, it isn't all that obvious. And when they fly, if they fly past you, you might not see it then either, because you have to be exactly the right angle to see it.
Yeah, that's all.
Thank you,
very
Ellen.
much. Yeah.
Okay, the brown family. Now, some people find these a bit tricky, but I'm sure after we've been through it, you'll find it dead easy in future because it isn't especially difficult. On the left, we've got the meadow brown, and we've got a male at the top and a female with a bit more orangey to it, a paler butterfly at the bottom. The male meadow brown and the female meadow brown normally, and I say that because I know that this one does look slightly aberrant, but normally has a black eye with a white pupil. A single white pupil. The ringlet has many black eye spots, all of them circled with a golden ring, a creamy halo I've called it there, okay? And only some of them have white pupils, but you can see that there's certainly more than 1 eye spot. On this one, we can see at least 8. And you could get more, or you might get fewer. You might only get 4 to 6. But whatever the number, the hind wing always has at least 4 obvious spots with white pupils. 1 pupil, 1 white pupil in each black spot. That is important. We'll come to that in a minute. But the meadow brown has no eye spots on the hind wing. Male at the top, female at the bottom. The ringlet, I've not bothered to show you male and female because they look identical. There's no difference. They look like this. And one way that if you see them and they're a bit worn, so you can't be certain about the eye spots to tell the meadow brown from the ringlet, is the ringlet has a much stronger contrast between this white outer margin. The meadow brown has a sort of creamy margin, which is less contrasted with the brown inside. So that contrast can be really helpful. As the butterflies, the ringlets wear, they can rub this margin off completely, so that isn't very helpful. But the eye spots on the hind wing are a giveaway. The only species that could possibly, but I don't think it would be confused with a ringlet when you've looked for the hind wing and the eye spots across the hind wing is the speckled wood, because there they are, look. But the speckled wood forewing has got so many creamy areas, creamy patches, without any eye spots, that I don't think you'll be confusing this with a ringlet. So both have eye spots on the hind wing. The ringlet has always got these 4. The forewings, the number of spots can be varied, but there are always at least 4 on the hind wing with this orange or golden ring halo around the black eye spot. This is very similar, but there are many more creamy patches on a speckled wood. So single eye spots, meadow brown, single pupil. Many eye spots, golden halos, ringlet. Again, eye spots with golden halos, but many pale patches, speckled wood. Now let's look at the, my screen's gone off, one moment, sorry. Let's look at the gatekeeper. And I see it still says ringlet there, which is a mistake, I beg your pardon. But we can see, look, two white pupils in the eye spot, but also a far more orangey colour and a contrasting black outer margin. This is a male gatekeeper, despite the fact it says ringlet there, I apologise again. And this is a female gatekeeper, two white eye spots, and look at the amount of orange. This is the female meadow brown, which is larger. The size is about right here. I've got these about the right size relatively. So the meadow brown female is larger and she's much darker with patches of orange, whereas here the whole wing is orange apart from the dark margin. So ringlet, look at the eye spots on the hind wing, overall very dark, speckled with pale patches. Oop, wrong way, sorry. Gatekeeper, much more orange. This is the male with the scent marks here, and this is the female without. The extra little spots here, by the way, are not because this is a female. It's just, as I said about the ringlet, the number of spots can vary in the ringlet and the gatekeeper, and you do occasionally get these extra spots. Looking at the underside, again, actually, I think, it's fairly easy to tell them apart when you know what you're looking for. A single eye spot on a meadow brown with a single white pupil. An eye spot here on the gatekeeper with two pupils. Many, many eye spots on a ringlet, each one with its golden halo, and most of them, not on the forewing, but most of them have a white eye center and a white pupil. Speckled wood has a single spot there, usually with one spot in it, but the fact that it's got this fluted appearance with its veins like that is a good clue, and it's sort of mottled, isn't it? Whereas the meadow brown is much more uniformly coloured in bands of orange, dark, and then paler as you go out. The small heath that we already looked at is much smaller. It has, like the meadow brown, a single spot here with a white pupil, but we've got this pale streak here, which only goes halfway. This pale streak on the meadow brown goes the whole way across, doesn't it? And then there's a darker outside. And here it's only halfway, and then there's a darker outside. So the small heath has a small streak of pale. The meadow brown has a big or complete streak of pale. And the gatekeeper has something which is sort of a mix of both. It's got this complete streak of pale colour and then another separate one, a bit like the small heath. It's not quite half, but there's a small streak of pale and then a big streak as well. And usually 3 or 4 little tiny little eye spots on the gatekeeper, which looks, again, just as the upper side did, more orange than the meadow brown. This is a particularly charming butterfly in my opinion, and it's one of those that tends to sit on hedges in gardens and flowers in gardens and things and brightens the place up no end. Butterflies like the ringlet and the meadow brown tend to lose themselves in the grass rather more often, but the gatekeeper always seems to want to be on top and showing off its lovely colours. So I rather like the gatekeeper. So just to go through these again very quickly. Single spot, meadow brown with a long streak. Single spot, single eye pupil. Small heath with a small streak. 2 white eye pupils. Then it's an orange background and 2 bits of streaks, gatekeeper. Lots and lots of spots, all single pupils though, but golden ringed, a ringlet. Because of all these rings, it's called a ringlet. And then the speckled wood, which does have a pupil here, not visible in this picture, unfortunately, but there usually is a white pupil center to that black eye spot. But the whole thing is a pattern of pale and dark, pale and dark, pale and dark, and the same on the hind wing, but with these wing veins that stand out to make this fluted appearance. And there's one more brown butterfly, which you could see in Berkshire on the heathlands, and that's the grayling. And the grayling, as you can see, has 2 spots on the forewing, each with a single white pupil, and it can have more than one, but usually one on the hind wing here. But this is a big butterfly, and it's a master of camouflage. So it's bigger than a meadow brown, and it's a very strong flying butterfly. It recalls something like a red admiral when it flies away from you. And it has this amazingly good trick of, well, not trick, but evolution has taught it that when it lands, it will deliberately tip its body so that it casts no shadow at all, which makes it very hard to pick it out as a 3-dimensional object. It's chosen homes which are the same color as its background. So the underside of the grayling will look like the sort of dry ground with bits of dead grass and so on that it sits on. It's incredibly well camouflaged, and the fact that it doesn't throw a shadow underneath itself because of the way it sits means that it's really hard to focus on it. So you'll be walking along a path across a sandy bit of heath, and something quite big and apparently orange gets up and flies away in front of you, and you think, what was that? Was it a painted lady? It was quite big and strong flying. And you'll see it settle maybe 3 meters in front of you, perhaps 5 meters in front of you, not very far. But as you get close to where you saw it settle on the path in front of you, you just can't see it until you startle it up again. So you have to approach very cautiously and look to see if you can spot any sort of movement, or perhaps just the edge of the wing where it's got the pale margins, because it's a master of camouflage. It's very rare to see a grayling sitting, showing the forewings like this. That's why I was holding this one, so that I could hold it with its wings open to show you what this looks like. You do occasionally, especially if you find a male and a female displaying to each other, you'll see them flashing these orange insides and those eye spots, but when they settle on the ground normally, they fold up like this and they virtually disappear. One more member of the brown family, which, as you will have spotted as soon as you see the picture, isn't very brown at all. So black and white contrast. Some people could conceivably mix it up with one of the whites, but I don't think you would. One of the things about it which is worth noting is that the black marks, or the very dark grey marks, run across the wing. So they don't go along the veins the way that some other butterflies' marks go along the veins. These go across the veins. So, So the female, I wasn't going to say that, but I brought up the picture I wasn't expecting. The female is a much more golden color, exactly the same pattern as the male, but golden. There's the male underneath. So it's a mating pair here. But the green veined white, that was the picture I was expecting to appear next. Can you see that the pattern of grey scales go along the veins? Here, the grey goes across the veins, and there are some little eye spots. But ignoring that, the thing that strikes you first is the way that the pattern goes across the veins, and here it's along the veins. So marbled white, which is a brown species, and a really beautiful one, I think everybody would agree. It's become much more common in the Upper Thames branch region. I doubt there's anywhere in the Upper Thames branch region that you couldn't find one if you were to look hard at the moment. It's a really, really nice addition to most people's butterfly trip. And I would say it's only in the last 15 years it's become ubiquitous right across the area. Okay, we're into the blues. So do we have any questions about the browns, please?
Yep, we have 3 brown butterfly questions. So firstly, is there a difference between the meadow brown and ringlet flight patterns?
Not enough that I can describe it, I'm afraid. I think it would be fair to say that meadow browns are more often prepared to fly high and go right up into the tops of big trees. And I think that ringlets more likely to stay a bit lower, but no, their actual flight when they're flying around in the grass are very similar.
And then do the meadow brown ringlet and gatekeeper emerge at different times?
Yes, usually the meadow brown is about a week before the ringlet, and the gatekeeper about a week to 10 days, the gatekeeper after the ringlet. So it's meadow brown first, then ringlet, then gatekeeper, but they're all flying at the moment. And so is the marbled white flying at the moment, and the small heath flying at the moment, and the grayling flying at the moment. So they're all flying at the moment.
Thank you. And there's another question coming, so 2 more. So have you ever seen a meadow brown with 2 pupils in the forewing eye spot?
Yes, unfortunately I have. That does happen more often on the females than the males, but you can always tell it from the gatekeeper, from the fact that the gatekeeper is mostly orange. Let's go back to that picture. Here we are. So there's so much more orange on a gatekeeper on the right in these pictures, despite the fact that it says ringlet, sorry about that again, that you can easily tell it from the meadow browns, which are much browner overall. And the contrast of the dark margin of the gatekeeper against the orange center is quite remarkable, compared with the sort of basically uniform brown across the wings of the meadow brown. So it's a very good way of telling them apart, usually to look for the single eye spot with a single pupil on the meadow brown, but you can get 2 pupils in a meadow brown, unfortunately.
And then the final question so far is, the gatekeeper pictures appear to have checkering pattern along the wing edge. Is this diagnostic?
What a brilliant observation, or what a stupid person I am, because I hadn't seen that, and now that someone says it, yes, there is, isn't there? I shall have to go away and look at all my pictures of gatekeepers, but that would appear to be a diagnostic. The veins are dark and they pierce the pale margins. So it's got a grey margin like the meadow brown rather than a white one like the ringlet. But yes, that does appear to be a distinguishing feature. Well done, whoever said that. What a clever, no, observant person. And how dumb I am not to have spotted it. Thank you very much. Excellent. I shall put that on my slides for next year. Okay, we'll move on. We're on to the blues. Small drum roll. Okay, we're going to start by looking at 2 that people see in their gardens, and often actually make the mistake of assuming that the butterfly here on the left is the one they're seeing because it's got the word common in its name. In fact, in gardens, holly blue here on the right is commoner in gardens. So the common blue is commoner across the country as a whole, but in your garden, you're more likely to see a holly blue. And I'm going to draw your attention to 2 things. The point that was just made about the margins being checkered on a gatekeeper. You can see the forewing of the holly blue does have a checkered margin, black veins through the white margin. And a common blue has a completely clear border. That's the upper side, and the underside completely clear, but checkered on the holly blue. So they look very similar, but if you can see the margin, then you can see that holly blue has a checkered margin, common blue is clear. And if you can see the undersides, you can see that the common blue always had these orangey coloured marks on the hind wing and sometimes on the forewing, but the holly blue never has any red or orange anywhere. Now there are 2 blue butterflies that have no red lunules, as they're called down here. Neither species has red lunules. The holly blue with its black through the margin on the forewing, and the small blue. And the best way to tell these apart is to look at the shape of the black marks on the white or the silvery coloured ground colour. The small blue is really small. It's almost never seen away from its food plant kidney vetch. The holly blue is seen everywhere. So if you see a butterfly you think could be one of these and you're not near kidney vetch, then I'd be 90% certain you were looking at holly blue. Holly blues have these streaks of black on a very white background, and the small blue has circular dots of black on a silvery background with white rings around the black. I've been through all this before in other slides, so I'm going to move on now and look at the blue species which do have red lunules. So those 2, holly and small, no red, no orange anywhere. But all these that we're looking at now, and there are several, do have red or blue, red or orange somewhere on their possibly blue wings. I was thinking about the fact that the brown argus, male and female, are brown. It is a blue family butterfly, but there is no blue at all. You can see a hint of blue on the body hair, but that's it. This is a common blue female. And remember, these things are quite small, and if they're some distance from you and moving about, you might be tempted to think that this common blue female doesn't have much blue either. But you can see if you look carefully at a still photo, there are patches of blue. Most common blue females will have some vestiges of blue somewhere. And as I've said repeatedly in various videos, it always looks a bit shabby. It looks like it's worn this particular dress many times before. It's been washed once too often. It's starting to lose its color. The brown argus, even when it's quite an old specimen and starting to be a bit worn out, always looks much more contrasted with bright colors, which is a good way to tell them apart. But a better way is to look at the wing margin, where you can always see some hint of veins coming into the white margins. The common blue, we've said it before, has clear borders. So that's a brown argus, male and female look like this. This one's a male because it's got a long, thin abdomen. The female common blue looks very similar, but she's got hints of blue, far less contrasted lunules, not as red. And you can see she's a female because she's got a shorter, fatter abdomen. Now, on the underside, the brown argus and the common blue show some features which are also absolutely certainties for getting a positive identification. This little mark here, called a figure of 8, sometimes referred to as a colon, on the hind wing of the brown argus, you can see the black veins going through. So this is a brown argus. Those two spots there on this butterfly are this spot and this one. So there's a fairly smooth progression up that side and then across here. But here the spots have moved out of line and come together. They sometimes physically touch. The white rings surrounding the black pupils in the center physically touch to form a complete figure of 8, but usually it looks like a colon in this, as in this picture. And you'll also notice the brown argus has a space here, or a bare area, brown argus, bare area, where on the common blue there is a spot. So that's the cell spot, bare area, that's the cell spot, additional spot on a common blue. The common blue and the chalk-heel blue, I don't think these would be easily mixed up, although it is possible. Sometimes people get quite excited about having seen a chalk-heel blue because they've seen a common blue with a slightly thicker black margin here. You can see there's a very thick black margin on a chalk-heel blue, but you'll notice, once again, we can tell a common blue by its clear borders, and the chalk-heel blue has got black veins through the borders, and it's a much paler, almost silvery blue color. They don't all have red lunules here. Some do. The chalk-heel blue is a very variable butterfly actually, and it can appear quite different, but this basic pattern of silvery powdery blue or chalky blue compared with a much more violet colored blue of the common blue should help you. The chalk-heel blue is slightly larger, and it's only found, usually it's only found where horseshoe vetch grows, which is pretty much restricting it to limestone and chalk soils. And here are two very similar in the sense that they've both got black veins going through the outsides, butterflies, the Adonis here and the chalk-heel, which are often found together because they both feed, their caterpillars feed on horseshoe vetch. But I think you can see they're different. And I hope you can see that the common blue up here is a different shade of blue to the Adonis, which is startlingly blue. So here we are, all three of those, the undersides, and the common blue, the underside, perhaps a bit like I was saying about the brown argus compared with the common blue. It's not quite so strikingly contrasted. It's slightly muted, but it's still very pleasant. and it's still got clear borders. The Adonis has got the veins coming through, as has the Chalkhill, but the Chalkhill is really fairly easily told from the other two because the Chalkhill has such a pale forewing and then a sandy brown or even chocolate brown hindwing. There's a real contrast between the ground colour of the forewing of a Chalkhill blue compared with the hindwing. Unfortunately, the Adonis blue does often look a very, very great deal like the common blue, and if it's been worn, if it's an old one and the margins have rubbed away, then it can be very difficult to tell the difference between a closed wing Adonis blue and a closed wing common blue. So it's best not to try and tell those two apart from their undersides, which are very similar. It's best, if you can, to get a look at the absolutely electric blue of the top side of the Adonis, but obviously that isn't always possible. So here they are compared top side, and I don't think I've certainly never taken, and I've rarely seen, a picture of an Adonis blue that does justice to the absolutely startling blue that these butterflies are. They're beautiful. But the thing that helps you tell them apart from their color, because if you just see one of these butterflies somewhere, then it's difficult to hold the image in your mind of what they look like when they're side by side. Look at the borders. Once again, we're back to wing edges, people. And clear border, common blue, black veins going through the white border, Adonis blue. Now, sadly, this idea that you can have a clear border and it's a common blue falls down, because one of these two butterflies on the screen at the minute is a common blue, but the other one isn't. So your first challenge, folks, which one do you think is the common blue? And if you really want to have a go for it, you might try and guess what the other one is, found within the Upper Thames branch area. So clear borders, unbroken white, but that's on both, which doesn't really help us here. The silver-studded blue has a wider black margin. So which one's got the wider black margin? This one. This slightly smaller butterfly is a silver-studded blue, but it does look, unfortunately, quite like the common blue, both with clear borders, but smaller, a silver-studded blue, with a black margin inside that white border, which really is quite contrasted and a bit thicker. You might be wondering at this point, unless you already know, of course, why is it called silver-studded when there is no sign of any silver stud? And the answer is we have to look at the underside. So these are both males, by the way. The females of both are brown, and similar rules apply in that although they're both brown with some orange lunules around the edges, the female common blue has a little bit of black between the lunules and the white margin, and there is much more black between the lunules of the female silver-studded blue and the white margin. But here are the undersides of those two species, and I wonder if you can guess which one is the silver-studded blue. So here we are on this side, the silver-studded blue. Now I would argue that stud just there isn't exactly silver, but let's not be too picky about it. This is an exquisite little butterfly, the silver-studded blue, and this is an equally charming but not so rare, so therefore somehow in our minds not quite as precious butterfly, the common blue. And once again, there are differences in the shape. Look, these are slightly more rounded, not quite so pointy, the little black marks here, and that black line on the inside against the margin is much stronger than here, very thin line, but much more pointy lunules. So there are differences once you get your eye in, but those two are similar, I can't deny. Shiny blue studs, as it says. I'm not really sure why somebody called it silver studded, because they are shiny blue. Okay, and here's the females, and as I said, look at the amount of black inside the lunules. Yes, it's quite thick, but look at this, much thicker. And you can perhaps guess what these red lines are going to tell us about here. clear white margins. The silver-studded blue here has no white lunules at all on the hind wing, but here they usually are quite clear white lunules on a female common blue. But the width of that black margin inside the white outer margin, I think it's fairly clear. I think these are easier to tell apart than the males in some way. Okay, female Chalkhill and female Adonis blue are a real pain, and I would definitely suggest that if you can, try and separate the males rather than the females, because the females are tricky, very tricky, especially as I'm afraid this is my best picture of a female Chalkhill blue, sad to say, but you can see it's quite worn and it's lost a lot of its detail here. But there would have been less. The Adonis blue is more contrasted and with some hints of blue in these little lunules, as they're called, on the hind wing. But they are extremely difficult to separate, and it is very definitely the case that if you go to a site where you can see only male Chalkhills flying, then the females flying there that might look like this Adonis blue, but they're probably female Chalkhills if only male Chalkhills are there. But there are quite a few sites in our area where happily we've got both the Chalkhill blue and the Adonis flying together on site, and then it really is difficult to tell them apart. Sorry, I can't give you a great deal of help there. Now we're still talking about the blues family, but we're moving into the hair streaks. I'll go through this because we're nearly at the end now, and that will give people a chance to draw breath. So we've got the purple hair streaks, the male, purpley like that, the female. Underside, grayish, very pale, looks quite silver when it's flying around in sunlight with some white stripes. These white stripes are the ones that give it the name hair streak. And two little eye spots there. These are occasionally found down at low levels because they emerge from pupa that pupate in the soil, and you sometimes find them when they've just emerged quite low down, but they spend most of their life at the top of oak trees. And this also can be seen at the top of oak trees, this holly blue. Just put that in there to make people aware. If you see something extremely pale flying around the top of a tree, you can't necessarily presume it to be purple hair streak because it could be holly blue, so you need to look to see if there is a grey colour with a white stripe across it, which often involves using binoculars, folks. And then something else you can find around the top of a tree, the white letter hair streak, which is much more likely to be found flying around the top of an elm tree because that's where it lays its eggs. I don't think you're going to have the problem of confusing it with a black hair streak because I think these have finished flying this week. We think they've come to the end of their season now. But the black hair streak, should you see one somewhere where you can get a good view of it, you'll see it's got these black blobs. And there is a solid black line on a white letter hair streak here. And these are right through, widespread through the 3 counties, but they're always in relatively discrete colonies near elm trees and always in fairly small numbers. The black hair streak is found where you've got blackthorn, but there's blackthorn everywhere. So for some reason it chooses the clay vale of Oxford and Aylesbury. And as I say, I don't think you're going to see one now. You might this weekend, somebody might pick up the last black hair streak in our region. I wouldn't be surprised if there's 1 or 2 still flying, but you'll be very lucky to find one. And it will look quite worn out because they're just finishing their flight season, whereas the white letter hair streaks are just getting going really in some areas. So those should be visible on elm trees and perhaps coming down to bramble and thistle, which they do, especially the females, to take nectar. And then one last hair streak, one last butterfly of our season. In the Upper Thames area, we're lucky enough to have the beautiful brown hair streak. And it's quite a large hair streak. So it is entirely possible if you see one flying next week or at the beginning of August, not next week, the week after next or the beginning of August, that you could confuse it with the gatekeepers, which will still be flying. They look quite similar when they fly, but when they settle, the hair streak across the hind wing should help you. And also the fact that there are no eye spots. The brown hair streaks, also the clay veil of Oxford and Aylesbury, but at the moment, although this is a slightly more restricted distribution because the black hair streak goes slightly further west and all the way across to the east of the county and out into Bedfordshire, Northamptonshire, and so on. The brown hair streak is restricted from about just to the west of Oxford through to around about Bicester. So it's got a slightly smaller distribution, but it is spreading quickly. So you could see brown hair streak anywhere from around Abingdon across to Tame and up to Buckingham, I would say. It is possible. And this also feeds, like the black hair streak, feeds on blackthorn, but this feeds on very young growth of blackthorn. So where a farmer has not been cutting the margins, or perhaps where they've got a wildflower strip in a margin and they've let the blackthorn grow out a little bit, that's the sort of place that the brown hair streak really loves. So a lovely butterfly, as you can see, absolutely gorgeous. And we're very lucky that it's spreading in our region. So 2 white lines there. If you remember, the purple and the white letter hair streaks have a single white line on the hind wing, but I don't think you're going to mix it up with those because it's so obviously orange, the brown hair streak. Okay, that brings us to the end of all the butterflies. I'll just mention that it is a good idea to record your sightings, please, folks, because we can't conserve things, and the recording apps are free. Either this one to go on your phone, which helps because it does the GPS for you, or you could download all the stuff about the big butterfly count. You can get that on your phone, or you can download this chart from Butterfly Conservation, or you could use this app called Butterflies for the New Millennium, which goes onto your PC to record your butterfly sightings. So please consider doing that. The I Record Butterflies app, the Big Butterfly Count poster and app, or the PC recording portal, as they call it, Butterflies for the New Millennium. And I'll stop and see if you've got any questions there, please, Ellen.
Yep, we have 2 questions so far. So firstly, when will the Adonis Blues fly?
They're not flying at the moment, and I think it might be mid-August before they begin. They might start in the first week of August, but I think it'll be mid-August because everything's a bit late this year. So I would think probably another 2.5 weeks, perhaps 3 weeks.
Thank you. And is there a particular time of day which is good for spotting purple and white letter hair streaks?
Well, apparently, purple hair streaks are easiest to find if there's a relatively small number of them about in the early evening, sort of 6 till 7 o'clock on a very sunny evening. If you look at the top of oak trees, people tell me that they're easier to find then. My experience has been that I can find them pretty much all day long. So I'm not quite sure about that, but it definitely is the case that they are active late into the evening. The white letter hair streak, I don't think that's true of them. I don't think they are particularly active in the evenings, although they may well be active in the evening. They are definitely more active during the sort of 9:30 through till 5 o'clock time of day.
Okay, thank you. And we got some more questions coming in. How do I record moth sightings?
There is an I Record moth section. So there's a website called I Record where you can record your sightings of absolutely everything. And when you go there, I'm afraid I don't remember precisely, but when you go to enter your records, there is a drop down and you can choose what it is you'd like to record. So you can choose dragonflies or spiders, and moths is one of those drop down submenu choices. And then it will give you the names of moths. When you start to type in, and let's for instance say elephant hawk moth, somebody mentioned, if you put in ELEP before you get any further, it will say elephant hawk moth, and you click on that and then it lets you enter your details. So there's I Record, but it's not, I'm afraid, available on a phone because there are just too many moths, 2,500 species. So that's for PC only. all laptops.
Thank you. Do you have a preference for us to use iRecord versus the big butterfly count?
No, I don't think I do. I think that whatever suits you. I personally use iRecord because I started using it before the PC recording portal Butterflies for the New Millennium became available. So I've carried on. But I don't think it makes any difference really. Both of them feed their data through to the same databases in the end. It all gets stored in the National Archives. So whichever one suits you best.
Thank you. How long do the Adonis Blues fly? So do they fly into September?
Yes, they do. In fact, on very rare occasions, they might fly into October.
And on a similar topic, are Chalk Hill Blues flying now?
Yeah, the Chalk Hill Blues definitely are flying now. They were first spotted, I think, on the 5th of July down at Larden Chase in Berkshire, but they're now flying right the way across our 3 counties at the sites where you see them. So I'm afraid not on clay soils, but in the chalk and limestone areas of our 3 counties.
Thank you. That's all the questions so far.
Okay. Well, I've been talking for quite long enough, so I'll give people chance. Oh, yes, there's the iRecord app, which you can get for the phone, but it doesn't it's one that does everything. And if you want to do the moth submenu, I think you need to use your PC for that. But there's what the iRecord logo looks like. And it's very good because you can record literally everything, plants, mammals, anything you want. So it's a very powerful tool. And I'm just going to finish with one slide. I do hope that people who've been looking at this have thought about the fact that the pleasure we get from butterflies and moths is only possible as long as there are butterflies and moths to get that lovely, lovely feeling of elation from when you see them. And we need to do something to make sure we keep them. The tremendous progress that the human has made on the earth means that the butterflies and moths, along with all the other animals and plants, are gradually disappearing. And butterfly conservation really could do with some money to employ more people to do some more conservation work. Our volunteers give millions of pounds worth of free time, but by employing people, there's something about sending a professionally employed person along to speak to a landowner that has that little bit more cachet than one of us volunteers turning up and saying we represent butterfly conservation. So if you've enjoyed this series of talks, or if you've endured this series of talks and you feel that you'd like to do something to try and help butterflies and moths, then perhaps you'd like to consider donating to butterfly conservation. But I'm not going to say any more about that. That's entirely down to you. Do we have any more questions, please?
No more questions. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I shall stop sharing and we'll go back and we can make a decision, Carla, whether you think perhaps time to call a day.
Sure. I just wanted to say thank you very much again, Nick, for all your expertise, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed learning your top tips on identifying late summer butterflies. My top tip takeaway is the dotty dark green fritillary and the silver stripes. So thank you very much.
Yep. Well, the silver stripe woodland. Yep. That's a good. The DG and SW, it's a good tip, I think, but I can remember things that alliterate, like the common blue having a clear border. Thanks again to Carla. Excuse me, I'll just have a drink. Thanks again, Carla, for hosting this series of meetings.
You're very welcome.
And thanks to all the people who've listened in and managed to put up with me talking for over an hour, which is quite an achievement.
The time flew by.
All right, and thanks to Ellen for fielding the questions. And unless anyone else has jumped in, Ellen, with a question at the end, then
no, just a lot of thank yous going to you for a great talk. So thank you from me as well.
You're very welcome, Ellen. Thank you for your help. Thanks again, Carla. Thanks to the Parks Trust, and thanks to everybody for listening. Hope to see everybody out there looking for and recording butterflies and moths. That'd be great. Good night then, everyone.
Good night.
Yep.